I want to welcome everyone to this very special event. In a few moments, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Caroline Glick about a topic of immense importance today, to hear about her new book, Beyond the Israeli Solution, and to hear her words on Beyond the Two-State Solution. First, as you know, I want to thank our sponsors tonight, the Congregation Bnai Yeshurun Adult Education, the One Israel Fund, and a very special thank you to the primary sponsors tonight, Chani and Lenny Grunstein, dedicating the evening Le'ila Nishmas Moshe Yonatan Ben Yehuda Aryeh Leib. Right, Teaneck Shmoso Tzurvat Zarachayim. When we planned the evening, I should tell you, we were afraid that the Mother's Day celebrations would depress the crowd. Apparently Mother's Day is not the holiday it once was. Unless you all celebrated already. First, as I'm sure you did, happy Mother's Day to everyone, especially to Caroline as well. First, a few words about the Dolev Homes for Youths at Risk, the flagship institution in Dolev, which, if you're not familiar with Dolev, it's a yeshuv in the Binyamin region, just a stone's throw from Talmon, if that helps you. But it's actually just a few miles east of what was once the Green Line, not far from Beit Aryeh, Hashmonaim, and Modi'in in that region as well. The Dolev Homes for Youths at Risk now encompasses a network of institutions that deal with children coming from disadvantaged or even dysfunctional backgrounds. They simply cannot live at home. And they go to these homes and are raised, and they become productive individuals, boys and girls, many of them now men and women, making a significant contribution to society, whereas otherwise they might have been lost, fallen between the cracks. I visited the main institution in Dolev over a decade ago. The work that they do there has now proliferated into other parts of the land of Israel as well. Of course, we ask for your support, those who wish to contribute and help the Dolev institutions, the Homes for Youths at Risk, can make a check later this evening to the One Israel Fund, earmarked for Dolev, and it'll get there. We'll have our share in training the next generation of Jews. For a few words about the Dolev Homes for Youth at Risk, I'm delighted to present the Director of Development, Mimi Tzadok, for a few words, followed by a brief video. Mimi, bakasha.
I want to thank Rabbi and the sponsors and the synagogue here and One Israel Fund for hosting us today, and of course Caroline Glick. We're very honored to share the podium with you tonight. And Caroline actually gave a special parlor meeting for us years ago in Efrat for the school, and we were very proud to have her there at that time. This is a special organization that was started as a small school around 27 years ago in the Yeshuv Dolev, which, as Rabbi said, in the Binyamin area, near Modi'in, if you know where that is, and near Hashmonaim and Talmon. And a group of Bnei Akiva graduates wanted to help a weak factor of the Israeli society, which happened to be girls literally hanging out on the streets. They weren't studying, and one of the Bnei Akiva folks came up to her, who was a teacher, and said, "Why aren't you at school?" And they said, "Oh, who can study? My mom's very sick, and my dad left a long time ago." And the other girl says, "Yeah, and I have to take care of my brother and sister, and who cares anyway? That's life. That's the way it is." So they said, "Oh, no, that's not the way it has to be. We know that you have the potential to succeed. And we know that just you've had a little bad mazel in your life, but that doesn't mean that you can make yourselves a positive and productive way of life, but you need help. And so we're going to help you." And so they started with 10 girls in 1987, and they brought them to Dolev, to this community, and they decided that they would not only teach them reading and writing and Jewish subjects as well, but they would also bring them into their homes and show them how a nurturing, loving family could be. So every member of Dolev had a mandate to this day, has a mandate to mentor a student at Ulpanat Dolev. So they have a family that they go to every other Shabbat, each girl. Plus, now, if you see in this folder, it says all in a mishpachton family. A mishpachton is a group home, which means a nuclear family that have their own one or two young children. They care for 12 teenage girls, all under one roof, who also have problems from the ages of 11 to 18. And in addition, we have a home for graduates, for girls who are not ready to live independently on their own and don't have a family to support them emotionally as well as financially. And so we have homes for graduates. Now we are a network using the programs, the successful programs at the Ulpana. We've now expanded to, with the help of the Ministries of Education and the Ministries of Welfare, who, by the way, subsidize 80% of our budget. And now we've expanded to help boys and girls, Haredi, secular and religious, in the cities of Ashdod, and also in the city of Modi'in. And we have 2 groups for Haredi girls at risk who have problems at home, and we're helping them get back on track in Jerusalem. So we now have a network of projects. We take care of over 500 boys and girls and get them on their way to become productive citizens, Baruch Hashem, in Israel. And I'm going to show you, I brought something special. These are cookies. We call them Mitzvah Cookies. You know why? Because part of our training of our girls at the Ulpana is a vocational training as far as cooking, baking for hotels, and also we have fashion design and sewing and computer repair, not only computer programming, but computer repair. And we have therapies such as art and drama and cosmetology vocation, and also equestrian therapy. You're going to see in the movie our equestrian therapy program that we deal with. We help the girls become more proud of themselves through caring and riding horses. So, and this other leaflet here is an article by the Jerusalem Post this April, and also last October they repeated it about the Ulpana in Dolev. And now I think we will show the movie. This is a movie about the girl in the movie in the red sweater was abused so bad by her father that he ended up in jail. She reported him. And but our graduates, we have many, many wonderful success stories, as you will see here.
When I first arrived at Dolev,
Thank you. May Hashem bless the boys and girls of all these homes in Dolev, Shelo Yedu Otsar, and may Hashem bless all of those who contribute and help make their lives a little easier. Could please raise the lights. I thank Mimi for her words. And again, a reminder about Dolev after the lecture tonight. Who's man? Perfect. This social hall has just undergone a renovation. We're still trying to get some of the kinks out. But I like the way the light just glides on. Very good. Whoever thought of that's very good. In any event, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Caroline Glick to our shul tonight at Congregation Bnai Yeshurun. It's been an objective of mine for many years to bring Caroline Glick here. Israel has only one effective Misrad HaHasbara, a ministry of information, of explanation. And in essence, those are Caroline Glick's columns and books in the Jerusalem Post. Carolyn is a native of Chicago, Illinois, a graduate of Columbia University, the master's at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And during her IDF service and thereafter, she was involved in some of the early negotiations with the Palestinians after the Oslo Accords, then became an advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu before he became Prime Minister, Foreign Affairs Advisor. And since the late 90s, she's been writing columns in the Jerusalem Post and Makar Rishon and elsewhere in the world, always with tremendous passion, insight, no holds barred, and as cogent as is possible, without having any blinkers or blinders, without having to toe any particular line to curry favors with elites. It hasn't made her popular everywhere, but it certainly made her popular here. And for that, we appreciate her. Most recently, Caroline Glick is the author of the new book, The Israeli Solution, and that leads to our topic tonight, Beyond the Two-State Solution. What sounds so fanciful at first, because for years, for almost 2 decades, from the salons of Europe and the diplomatic precincts of America, and even from much of official Israel, we've heard that the only solution to the problem in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors is to again partition the land of Israel and create a second Palestinian state. It's become almost a dogma. Now it's run into the shoals of difficulties with the realization that it's not going to work. It's not going to work for a variety of reasons, but better said, it shouldn't work for many, many cogent reasons. So therefore, we are right now in the throes of what should be a major paradigm shift, what has to be a paradigm shift, and how we look at the conflict between Israel and its neighbors, both internal and external. And there's no one who has articulated a clear, more concise, more insightful vision of that new paradigm than has Caroline Glick. It's a great privilege and honor for me to present to everyone here award-winning journalist Caroline Glick.
Thanks.
These cookies were baked by the girls in Dolev, by the way.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Przansky, and thank all of you so much for coming here. It really is an honor and a privilege to be with people who are such strong Jews and Zionists, and to share with you some of my thoughts about where we're going and what's happening, and why we really have reached a moment that must be a turning point in the way that we think about Israel, and Israel thinks about itself, and what our options are moving forward. So let me just, it's very funny. When I was just finishing the editing of my book last summer, John Kerry announced that, we've started negotiations, and in 9 months we're going to reach a comprehensive peace treaty between Israel and the Palestinians. So some of my friends and colleagues were saying, well, Caroline, what's going to happen? Your book is coming out March 4th, and he's saying that they're going to sign a peace deal by the end of April, and this is going to wreck everything. What happens if your book is overtaken by events? And I said, but my whole book just shows that this is going to fail. So if he's right, then I'm wrong, and it's a waste of time, and at least I got my advance, you know? So whatever, if it works out that I'm completely wrong, then I stand corrected. But I'm staking my professional reputation on the case that I make that this will never happen. And I'm fairly confident that I'm correct, which is why I just spent the last year writing this book. So I think it'll be okay. And in fact, it might end up being really good timing for my book that the peace process again fails right before my book, which explains why it failed and what we have to do, actually happened. So from my perspective, John Kerry was a godsend in terms of book sales and, also, so I owe him a debt of gratitude, at least for his timing. And indeed, the peace process has failed, as we know. Just a week and a half ago, the government of Israel decided to suspend indefinitely negotiations with the PLO because the PLO just signed a unity deal with Hamas and Islamic Jihad to form a coalition government which has a shared principle of annihilating Israel. So that didn't seem like a good deal anymore. Not that it was beforehand, but that put the kibosh on, the peace, the unity deal that Abbas was willing to sign. The peace treaty he was willing to sign and has already signed 3 times, in fact, is with terrorists who proclaim that their goal is to eliminate the Jewish people, not only in the state of Israel, but throughout the world. So that's done for now. And what Martin Indyk said the other day at the Washington Institute is true. I mean, he said, look, I mean, we found ourselves as the Americans in this process as the only party with any sense of urgency. The Palestinians didn't want it, the Israelis didn't want it, and here were the Americans trying to push forward with something that neither of the parties who are supposed to be the bride and the groom in this deal had any interest in actually joining in a union together. Only we, the Shadchan, and I don't know exactly what religion it would be, but whatever. We were trying to push this forward, and nobody was interested in moving, and therefore we really don't know what to do as long as they don't want to do it. How we can do this, and that's really the point. Is that the PLO doesn't want it. The PLO doesn't want it for a couple of reasons. One is because the PLO has never wanted a state. Their primary goal from the time in 1957 when Arafat founded Fatah has always been the elimination of Israel first and foremost. They don't have a vision for what a Palestine looks like. They don't have a vision they don't even have a real conceptualization of what a Palestinian people is. They only started referring to themselves as Palestinians when the Soviets told them to in the late 60s. So, they never saw themselves as that, and the only goal that they've been able to comprehensively set forth is how to destroy Israel, not how to build anything. So, the idea that they're suddenly going to have to contend with the state is something that they've never been interested in, and which is one of the reasons why they've rejected statehood, the Palestinian Arabs have, every time that it's been offered to them since 1937, and will continue to do so, because it's not what their primary goal is. Their primary goal is the destruction of Israel. And the other reason that they don't want it is because, unlike many people the Israeli left and also the American policy community writ large, and of course the Europeans, although they may know and be happy with this concept, is that if a Palestinian state is formed in Judea and Samaria, and if, as the United States was demanding, Israel was to pull back from the Jordan Valley and transfer control over the border between the east and the west banks of the Jordan River to the PLO, then that whole area and also the east bank of the Jordan River would be overrun by millions of terrorists who now live in the UN-run refugee camps and vacation spots like Damascus and Beirut. And these are the people who would be pouring really across the border, and everybody in their line of sight who is not an Al-Qaeda member or a Hezbollah member, Ahmed Jibril, PFLP member, would be dead and subjugated, and that includes the PLO leadership, which are considered traitors by the likes of Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and all the rest of them because they've been speaking with Jews and for the past 21 years. So they also would be annihilated. And by the way, this brings us to one of the many critical problems with the concept of a Palestinian state from an Israeli perspective. We hear so many warnings from Obama and Kerry and Indyk and the Israeli left, whether it's Omer or Tzipi Livni or Ehud Barak or Yair Lapid or whoever it is who happens to be in front of a microphone, that if we don't establish a Judenrein Palestinian state run by the PLO on the west bank of the River Jordan, by tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Israel is going to lose its Jewish majority, and we are facing an existential threat to the continued existence of the Jewish state, the likes we haven't seen since Noah and the flood. So, this is what they're telling us, but really the only serious existential demographic threat that Israel faces is the establishment of that Palestinian state. Because, again, everybody talks about, well, they have to give up their demand for a right of return of 5 million foreign-born Arabs who are the descendants, some of them are the descendants of the Arabs who left the land of Israel in 1948 and 1949, that they have to give up that right because that's an existential threat, and they're demanding that Israel destroy itself demographically in exchange for peace, which means that their offer of peace is disingenuous. How often do we hear that? Israeli leaders have been saying it since really 1993, that until the PLO agrees to give up the right of return, so-called, to Israel for these foreign-born Arabs, we're not going to be able to sign a peace deal with them. Okay, well, they haven't. But say tomorrow Abbas did give up this demand for a right of return to a truncated Jewish state within the 1949 armistice lines. Well, that doesn't mean that they're not going to come to the West Bank, right? They would, again, immediately flood the West Bank. We're talking about 5 million foreign-born Arabs coming in from Jordan, from Egypt, from Syria, Lebanon, who have, again, all been marinating in genocidal Jew hatred in these camps that are run by Al-Qaeda, by Hezbollah, by Iran, Revolutionary Guards, by Ahmed Jibril. And they will all come into Palestine. They would all enter into Jenin, Ramallah, Shechem, Hebron, Beit Lechem. Now, seeing where these people are coming from, seeing their worldview, seeing their allegiances to which organizations, we can't imagine for even a second, even in jest, that they would sit quietly at the border and, ish tachat gafno v'tachat te'anato, they're not going to cultivate their grapevines and their fig trees. They're not going to want to develop a high-tech sector and turn Palestine into a Singapore, right? They're going to want to turn Palestine into a Libya and an Afghanistan. And they will. And they will want to invade Israel, which will be extremely easy because, among other things, Jerusalem would be a divided city with joint sovereignty, and all they would have to do is walk in to Sha'ar Shechem, to the Damascus Gate, right, and walk out the Jaffa Gate, and within 15 minutes, they're blowing themselves up in Rehavia, in Malcha, in Gilo, no problem, because Israel, as we know, will be unable to defend itself. We would also be facing, of course, an insurrection from the Israeli Arabs. So, that the real demographic threat, the only serious demographic threat, the only existential threat from a demographic perspective, and obviously from a strategic perspective as well, but from a demographic perspective specifically, is the establishment of a Palestinian state. No other single act on Israel's part could possibly imperil the demographic balance west of the Jordan River more than the establishment of a Palestinian state. Nothing. That is a demographic threat to Israel. For some reason, nobody's noticed this. But again, think about what they're demanding. And think about what we're asking for. We're not saying you cannot have the right to an immigration policy that enables these people to enter into Palestine. That, after all, would be a colonialist demand. And by the way, it really would be unfair. If we're saying they can have sovereignty, what we're going to tell them that they can't determine their own immigration policy? Why? If we're saying that we agree that they should have independent rights, then we can't tell them that they can't determine who gets in. Now, the truth is, again, Abu Mazen wouldn't be the one determining who gets in. It would be Zawahiri determining who gets in, right? It's going to be Hassan Nasrallah. It's going to be Khamenei deciding who gets in. And they're going to get in all of the people who they want in. And that's millions of people who are from the Revolutionary Guards, who are from Al-Qaeda, who are from Hezbollah. That is the people, those are the immigrants that are going to be coming in and exercising their right of return to Palestine. So, okay, so we get it, or we're beginning to get that the two-state thing is really not a solution at all unless you're talking about a way to get to a final solution, which none of us want. So what are we supposed to do? Well, let's take a lesson from Parshat Shavua Behar, right? What is it about? It's about Shemitah. Right? So if we think for a second about what Shemitah is, we realize that Shemitah is not just a question of laying fallow your grounds, but it's also standing back and allowing natural processes to unfold, right? I mean, because, my fig tree in my backyard is going to bear fruit next year, whether, I'm planting vegetables or not in my garden, because it's just the natural flow of events. You have a tree, it continues to grow, right? The rain falls, God willing, and the nature continues to grow things, to produce things, whether it's weeds or whether it's weeds or whether it's fruits is something that we have to check. But nature continues to exist whether we're actively trying to master it or not. And that's really what Shemitah, I think, in many ways is about, is to remind ourselves that we aren't going to get instant gratification in our lives. That's not what a good life is about. A good life is about being a partner to nature and not thinking that it's all about us. It's understanding that there's one that understands and one that determines the course of history, and that, of course, is God. And that's why the Parsha says this land belongs to Hashem and not to Israel, that you can't sell land in perpetuity because it belongs to somebody else. It's granted to you, but the proprietorship, the ownership belongs to Hashem. So what do we learn? If we take a lesson of Shemitah and we're looking and we say, okay, what are the natural processes that are unfolding in Eretz Yisrael? What is happening? How are we to understand events? And taking this year from a perspective of a year to watch what's happening, once we understand them, where are they going to lead us to? So let's look at the region for a second. What is happening in the Arab world? Forgetting about our agency and how we can impact events if we throw all of the Jews out of Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, forgetting that for a second, leaving it aside, say, okay, well, what is actually happening in the larger Arab world? What is happening among the Palestinians? What is happening among the Israeli Arabs? And how are we to understand ourselves in relation to them? And then what is happening among the Jews of the land of Israel? How are they changing? What are the processes unfolding there? Again, regardless of a policy of this sort or that sort that the Israeli government may engage in for the purposes of dealing with our neighbors. So on the Arab side, on the Islamic side, we see, of course, that the promise of the Arab Spring was a lie. And what we are seeing is the self-destruction of the Islamic world, the self-destruction of our neighbors at their own sword, by their own hands. We see it in Syria, we see it in Libya, we see it in Iraq, we see it in Egypt, we see it in Lebanon. All of these governments are falling apart, and all of these societies are falling apart. This is good, this is bad, this is happening, right? 150,000 people are dead in Syria. 150,000 people are dead in Syria. You have a war of barbaric proportions. I mean, people are being crucified, literally, nailed to crosses. This is happening, right? You're having children being gassed with chlorine gas, with mustard gas. This is not the Somme in 1916. This is our neighbor to the north. While we're renting our tzimmerim for the weekend in the Golan Heights, we see artillery smoke coming up across the border 5 kilometers away from the northern Golan Heights because they're at war. They're in a state. Now, who is going to take over Syria? Is Assad going to retain control? Is he going to, at some point, lose control? Is Syria going to discombobulate into 15 different, postage stamp republics that are all at war with the other 14? Who knows? But what we know now is that whatever Syria we face is going to be fundamentally different from the Syria that we face since the establishment of the State of Israel. We see in Jordan, they have, in a country with just a few million people, they have over 1 million refugees from Syria that are fundamentally transforming that country. You have the Hashemite regime under stress the way that they've never been before, even, to the point where it's reasonable to argue that today the Hashemites are more stressed than they were in 1970 when the PLO tried to take over the kingdom. You have in Lebanon, you see the outflow of the Syrian war going into Lebanon and further stressing that poor country that just can't get a break. And you see in Egypt, so the military took over from the Muslim Brotherhood, but in the meantime, the Muslim Brotherhood just took over the government in neighboring Libya. So they're going to have a war. They're already at war with radical jihadists in the Sinai, and that's why they're declaring war on Gaza. I mean, this is a mess. You know, Iraq, I was an embedded reporter with the 3rd Infantry Division during the invasion of Iraq. And, you know, already at the time it was clear that the Americans had no idea what they were getting into. They thought they were liberating Paris in 1944. And they literally did not understand what they were doing. But they did great things in Iraq. But then Obama took all of the forces out in 2011 without a status of forces agreement with the Iraqi regime, and as a consequence, Iraq has become a satrapy of Iran. You have this crazy situation in the Gulf states, right? Cornell University founded a medical program in Qatar, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE just broke diplomatic relations with Qatar because it's the prime sponsor of Al-Qaeda and of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And so they don't even have relations with Qatar anymore because of its alliance with Iran and with Al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood. And you see the Americans coming in and taking their money so happily and sending doctors over there to train whomever. And in Iran, right, you have Iran just on the thresholds of becoming a nuclear power, frightening the heck out of all of its neighbors in the Gulf, stressing the Egyptians, and expanding its power and authority into the Arab world through the Syrian civil war, and Lebanon through Hezbollah, and Iraq, of course, which it's already essentially taken over since the Americans left. So you have this topography of, okay, you're gonna start hearing me spit, just for knowing, right? You have a topography of conflict and of strife and of self-destruction that is a horrible humanitarian situation for the people who live there. But from an Israeli perspective, what we see then is enemy state after enemy state after enemy state, taking Iran out of the equation for a second, that are vastly weaker than they were 5 years ago, that are in a much less secure position internally, and therefore much less competent to harm Israel than they have been in recent times. Now, you can ask from an Israeli perspective what it matters the outcome of the Syrian civil war, for instance. Well, I mean, I think that Israel would be better off with Al-Qaeda in charge than Iran. But at the end of the day, all of these forces hate us just the same. So that, to be perfectly mercenary about it, it doesn't really matter from an Israeli perspective who's in charge in Syria. I mean, if we can't get the Kurds in charge in Syria, basically, we can't impact. We're not going to convert Al-Qaeda members to Zionism, right? We can't even convince the PLO to become Zionists, and they need us to continue to exist. So, we should learn from the American failures and not think that we have it in our power to impact the hearts and minds of people who are driven by things that have nothing to do with what we do or who we are. And just say, look, our purpose is to be as strong as possible and to make it as difficult as possible for them to penetrate into our border so that we can continue picking blueberries in the Golan Heights while they're killing one another 2 kilometers away. Right? We want to maintain our peace. We can't prevent them from killing one another. What we can do and must do is prevent them from killing us and from having that violence spilling over into Israel. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of that. And so that's important. But the other aspect to the Arab self-destruction is demography. I don't know if you guys are aware, but there has been a collapse over the past generation in Arab birth rates and in Islamic birth rates throughout the Islamic world. Iran, for instance, was at almost 8 children per woman in 1979 at the time of the revolution. Do you know how many children women in Iran are having today? 1.4. This collapse in birth rates is unheard of in world history. It's never happened before. You went from 8 children per woman to 1 in one generation. They're not going to be able to support themselves in 30 years. They're not going to have children to support retirees. I mean, you have a similar situation happening of course, in Europe and in the West, and you've heard a lot about that in the media, that everybody's below a replacement level essentially today. And without Hispanic immigration into this country, the United States is at European birth rates, which means that it's not replacing itself. And this pattern that we see in Iran, we see in Yemen, we see in Egypt, we see in Saudi Arabia, we see in Jordan, we see in Lebanon, we see in Syria, we see in Iraq, and we see among Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. To a lesser degree because they're more prosperous and more stable than the rest of the Arab world because they're part of Israel. But Gaza has gone from 6.5 to 4.5. The West Bank Palestinians have gone from 4 to 2.9. And the Israeli Arabs have gone from 5.5 to 3.4. So this is a massive collapse in the amount of children that they're having, and also impacts, of course, the demographic balance between Jews and Arabs in the land of Israel. So that brings me to the segue of what's happening among the Jews. So among the Jews, well, let me just add one last layer of that before I get into the demography of Israel, or the Jewish people in Israel, because the other aspect of this is economics, right? Economics. So our neighbors have essentially no economies, right? I mean, the reason why Sisi was able to take over in Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood is because the Gulf states, who were afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood, agreed to bankroll Egypt, because Egypt was about to go into mass starvation. They have no foreign currency reserves. They had, I think, $5 billion in foreign currency reserves when the military took over the country from the Muslim Brotherhood last summer. They were already beginning mass starvation because they don't have the money. They're the largest per capita importer of wheat in the world, and wheat prices skyrocketed last year because of a worldwide drought, and Chinese demand expanded. So they couldn't afford to import the food they needed in order to feed their people. They didn't have enough money in foreign currency reserves to bring in the money that the food that they needed. And that was when Sisi came in, because the Gulf states agreed to bankroll him, and they gave him essentially $12 billion in cash. And that is what is funding the Egyptian government right now. It's Gulf money. That's all, and the Chinese are going to come in and prop him up also, so that he can be dependent on them. And Egypt, from an American perspective, this is a disaster because Egypt no longer trusts the United States and no longer needs the United States. So that aside, I mean, their economic collapse is taking place before our eyes. They don't have enough money to fund a war against Israel if they were in a military position to conduct one. They would have to choose between mass starvation and the overthrow of the regime, and or if in the case of war, or barely scraping by in the case of resisting the urge to kill Jews. Now, that's on their side. What's going on the Israeli side? Again, we're talking about Shemitah. We're not doing anything. Let's just look at the situation as it unfolds. Let us watch our fig tree grow, right? So our fig tree works out is getting a lot of fruit these days, okay? Because, as it turns out, Jews know how to go forth and multiply. We have risen in our birth rates from 2.1 per family in the 1990s to 3.04 children per family today, which means that we have outstripped the Palestinian Arabs in fertility rates. We are having more children than the Palestinians are. So they are not outproducing us, we are outproducing them. Okay? There are more Jewish babies being born per capita, per family, than Palestinian children are being born per family. Among the seculars, this is across the board, secular family, national religious families, and the only group that has gone down in birth rates is the Haredim, because of the child allowance stopped the per-child payments after 4. So because of welfare reform, the Haredi families have become smaller. They've gone, I think, from 8 children per family to 6.5. National religious has gone up to 5, and the seculars are pushing 3. And among Sabra women, the number of children per family is 3.5. So these are numbers that have no match in the Western world. Nowhere. Nowhere do you have this kind of situation where prosperity is bringing larger families. You add to the demographic natural birth rate that's expanded the fact that we are now at a precipice of an extremely large wave of aliyah, both from Eastern Europe and from Western Europe. When we look at the first 3 months of 2014, month on month, from France, 130% increase in aliyah rates. You see the same thing in other Western European countries with smaller Jewish communities like Belgium, like Switzerland, and even in England you're seeing a very large rise in the number of Jewish immigrants from England. And then, of course, in Eastern Europe, we're looking, Ukraine has 130,000 Jews. Aliyah rates since the Russian annexation of Crimea have also increased over 100%, right? Where you have more and you have these Jewish self-defense gangs getting together in Odessa to try to protect the Jewish people from slaughter. Well, I would say by the end of the year, many of them are going to be packing their bags and deciding to join the real Jewish Defense League, which is, of course, the IDF. So we are at a precipice of a very large wave of immigration, of Jews, of Aliyah, of Jewish families from Europe. We're seeing a very large and rising wave of natural growth in demographic growth among Israeli Jewish families. At the same time that the Palestinians, mirroring the wider phenomenon of the larger Islamic world, are also seeing a vast decrease and a continued erosion in the number of children per family. And this, by the way, is a consequence of very normal demographic trends, which is urbanization and the education of women. The more educated women are and the more urbanized the society is, the fewer children they have. In Israel, again, we are the outlier nation because the more prosperous we become and the more educated women are in Israel, the more children we have. So this is an anomaly. It is another aspect of Jewish uniqueness, particularly in the land of Israel, because, of course, in America, the same trends that govern the fertility rates of everybody else also govern Jewish fertility rates in the United States. Reformed Jewish families have the lowest fertility rate in the United States of any demographic group, but in Israel, the opposite is occurring. So that's demography. Now let's think about economics for a second. We had an amazing figure put out by the Ministry of Trade and Economy a couple of weeks ago. They said in 2014 or 2015, Asia is going to outrank North America as Israel's largest trading partner. Now, to understand how strange or how extraordinary this development is, we have to remember that Israel only opened diplomatic relations with India and China in 1992. So we're talking about a rate of growth in trade that is simply exponential, right? That we are growing, the trade between Israel and China and India is growing at almost geometric rates. It's growing, 7%, 10% a year on year. You have China is now becoming a major player in the Israeli economy. China invested, I think they've agreed to invest $5 to $10 billion, and I can't remember, and I know that there's a disparity between those two numbers, but I simply can't remember whether it's 5 or 10 to finance the construction of a fast rail link that will link the port of Eilat to the port of Ashdod, because they want to be able to move cargo from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean without having to use the Suez Canal. So, from the perspective of Israel, What this means, aside from the economic benefit that Israel will get from massively increasing the amount of cargo that's moving through its borders, we become the most strategically vital country in the Levant to dozens of countries in Asia and Africa and Europe that are going to be wanting to use this rail link to move their cargo from the Persian Gulf. This is an extremely important event because from the international community's perspective, and I'm not talking about Cathy Ashton and Ban Ki-moon and Obama, I'm talking about from the perspective of governments that are trying to figure out how to maintain and expand their economic prosperity. Because of that rail link that the Chinese are now building, Israel's strategic importance to them is going to expand phenomenally. The same, of course, we can say with the fact that we have now become a net exporter of energy. Right? Last year, Israel became a net exporter of natural gas. We also have shale oil in the Elah Valley by Beit Shemesh that we're waiting to see whether the environmentalists can be ground down in order to do a pilot study of that area, and if, as the concession holders of that oil claim, they are able to extract oil at $40 per gallon, well, the assumed reserves of the oil that Israel has under the ground are 60% of Saudi Arabia's claimed oil reserves, which means that if that actually comes to bear, and we'll know within 10 years, then Israel could become an oil giant as well. I mean, but, we don't know. We know it's there. We don't know how expensive it is to extract it. But what we're talking about is a jump already with the natural gas, already with the rail link between Eilat and Ashdod and Ashkelon that the Chinese are building. We know from the perspective of our own technological prowess that is making us the engine of technology for the entire world, right? We know that we're already in a completely different place than we were in 1993. And I'll add two more aspects to what's happening in Israel. The first one is I made Aliyah in 1991, which was really at the height of the Aliyah from Russia. I actually made Aliyah on May 28th, 1991, and on May 27th, 1991, the Ethiopians came. So, I came right then, right? I remember I got to the Ministry of Absorption at Old Ben Gurion Terminal, and everybody there was like hungover, and nobody cared, and they all said, just go back to America, we have a headache, Come back next week, we're tired, So I came there, at the height of this massive aliyah, when you had a country with about 4 million Jews suddenly expanding to 5 million Jews within a decade. And everybody in 1991, believe you me, they all told me how much they hated everybody else. I mean, they all thought, oh, little American coming to town, we can tell her, she's not like them. We'll tell her how much we hate the Ashkenazim, how much we hate the Sephardim, how much we hate the Russians, how much we hate the Ethiopians, how much we hate the rich people, how much we hate the poor people. Everybody hated one another in 1991. I mean, you're talking about it just ugly, and it was after the Gulf War. I came a few months after the Gulf War, and everybody was freaked out about what they had just undergone with the Scuds and Shamir and Bush, and yuck, right? So today, the Russians aren't Russians anymore, they're Israelis. I mean, the secular and the religious who had nothing to do with one another in 1991 are now studying together at yeshivot. Not to mention the fact that they're all serving together in Golani, but that the society has become so much more integrated. People have been absorbed. The million have been absorbed. And by the way, they didn't only marry Russians at all. Israel's economy is a completely different economy than greeted me when I stayed with some friends of mine, God bless them, in Gilo, and the first thing that my friend's brother told me was, you have to sign up for unemployment benefits. But I just got here yesterday. You deserve it. You made Aliyah, but I've never worked here. I never paid a tax. You deserve it. Sign up for unemployment, but I'm joining the army. No, Magielach. You have to do. Nobody says that anymore. But I mean, that was a completely different situation in Israel 22 years ago or 23 years ago when I came. Just different. It's a better country. It's a mature country. It's a much more prosperous country, and it's a much happier country. Much happier country. And that's the other thing that we have to understand. It's also a much more Jewish country. You know, I mean, when I remember my first army base, it was an education ministry army base, and we were in this agricultural college in Emek Hefer by Netanya. And I was on duty officer one Shabbat, and the agricultural college was bringing in a delegation of Africans to go through an agricultural workshop at the school. And we were in the dining hall, and they asked me, as the officer on duty, to have a Kabbalat Shabbat for their African guests. So I said, okay. And I asked one of my soldiers if she would light the candles. She didn't know the blessing. I couldn't believe it. I'd never imagined I was going to embarrass somebody with that question. But I think that today, if I ask that question, the likelihood of me getting the response from my soldier that she doesn't know the blessing for Shabbat candles would be far smaller than it was in 1991. Because Israeli society, it's not, of course, that we don't have lots and lots of secular Jews, and, you know, they should be healthy and happy and have as many kids as they want. They just... And prosperous, but the secular edge, the rejection of any immersion, any relationship to Judaism just isn't there anymore. That stiff-neckedness that's saying we don't want to have anything to do with traditional Judaism, that it's a backlash, it's a throwback. You don't hear it anymore. You don't see it anymore. And it's not just that I moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in 2002. It really, you know, I have my internal passport. I go back to Tel Aviv to visit everyone. But really, you know, I mean, it's not, it just, the ante isn't there anymore. And a lot of reasons for that, much of which are redound to the bitter experience of the fake peace process with the PLO. It's true. But look, you know, you don't move from a nation of disparate communities that came from the four corners of the earth that are all so different from one another and turn yourself into an integrated true nation that is one nation overnight. 66 years, though, three generations later, we have done it. It's a different country than the one that I made Aliyah to. It's a better country. It's more prosperous. There are more Jews. I mean, a colleague of mine was saying on an interview in Channel 2 that I subtitled and sent out into the airwaves in America that, you know, people say, the Americans are saying Israel's going to face a calamity if we don't enable a Palestinian state to be established tomorrow, a Judenrein Palestinian state, and we're going to face this international isolation, and we're not going to be able to stand up to it. And so he said to the interviewers, and they say it's going to be like after the Yom Kippur War with the Arab oil embargo, right? That's what they say, right? And we're going to be isolated and hated and everything. So he said to the Guy Bachor is the name of the man, the professor type, he's a Middle East expert, was being interviewed on Channel 2, and he said to the interviewers, do you know how many Jews were in Israel in 1973? No, how many? 1.9 million. 1.9 million, right? And you look at the economic power, right, of the Arab states, of the Gulf states in 1973, and you look at their decomposition today, we have 6.1 million Jews in Israel, 6.5 million Jews in Israel if we include, you know, the people who, for whatever reason, the rabbis don't want to convert, even though they live as part of Israel's Jewish community in completely, you know, who came from the Soviet Union. Right, we have 6.5 million Jews and others in Israel. And we have an Arab population that I forgot to mention when I was talking about the decomposition of the Arab world that wants more and more to integrate into Israel. You know, the PLO did an exceptional job in funneling money into radical anti-Semites among the Israeli Arabs that radicalized the entire population from 1993 on. I mean, they already had fertile ground to work with because the Arabs had first been radicalized after the Yom Kippur War with the OPEC money that was coming in to turn them into irredentists and to fund things like the Communist Party. But the PLO really took that ball and ran with it when they came in 1993 and were funding the most radical people among the Israeli Arab community who had seen how Israel had turned its back on all the Palestinians who had been working with it in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and were quick to realize that there was a new boss in town, and they started doing their deals with the Islamic movement, with Hamas, and with the PLO. So we saw things like the riots in the Israeli Arabs, really pogroms among Israeli Arabs in October 2000, where they were throwing Molotov cocktails at Israeli motorists traveling down Highway 65 from linking Tel Aviv to Tiberias, and taking Jews out of their cars and beating them on the roads, and then coming around and saying that police brutality when the police were trying to put them down. And we see today something happening. We had Balad party in the Knesset, for instance, Azmi Bishara, who had to flee the country ahead of an arrest warrant for treason after he had acted as a Hezbollah agent during the 2006 war. Right, so we have open treason being carried out by members of Knesset from these Israeli Arab parties. Hanin Zouabi, also from the Balad party, was on the Mavi Marmara terror ship when they were trying to bludgeon our commandos to death while breaking Israel's lawful maritime blockade of the Gaza coastline. So these kinds of things we now understand happen all the time. Land theft happens all the time, but there's a new trend going on among Israeli Arabs of clinging to Israel for dear life. We see, particularly among the Israeli Christians, Arabs, 300% increase year to year from 2012 to 2013 in voluntary conscription into the IDF by Israeli Christians. They are serving in the Israeli army. They're joining Tzahal. You have 90% of Israeli Arab girls and 75% of Israeli Arab boys support national service, which is the civilian equivalent of military service. You see more and more Israeli Arab families sending their children in places like Haifa to Hebrew language schools instead of Arabic language schools. They want to integrate. Now, why is this happening? Because while we're busy trying to give up the Jordan Valley and throw 350,000, 400,000 Jews in Judea and Samaria out of their homes, they're watching what's happening in Syria. And they're saying, no. We're Israeli. See our passport? No. Not us. We're not part of this. Anachnu medabrim ivrit. That's what they're saying. The Israeli Christians are saying, we're not Arabs. We're not Arabs. We're Assyrians. We're Assyrians. We're Armenians. We're anything. These are the people who were the promoters of pan-Arabism, right? Starting in the 19th century in Beirut, because they saw Arab fascism as their way out of dimitude, that if the laws of Omar would be revoked, which made them into second and third class citizens in Islamic caliphates, and were replaced by a fascist government where they could be equals even though they weren't Muslims, then that's what they wanted. And that's why you had people like George Habash, one of the most prolific PLO terrorists, was a Christian. You had Tariq Aziz, Saddam Hussein's foreign minister, was a Christian. Because they saw in the pan-Arab movement their way of getting out of dimitude, of the second-class status that non-Muslims have in Islamic regimes. So now suddenly among the Israeli Arabs, who were very, very supportive of pan-Arabism and very openly anti-Semitic, now you suddenly see them saying, we're not Arabs. This is, again, a revolutionary shift in the way that people are viewing their own identities. So the Arab world is falling apart. Identities are shifting and changing before our eyes. People who we thought were members of unitary or even multi-ethnic nation states are now decomposing. They're changing. They're viewing themselves differently. Their allegiances are all shifting. The Palestinians are not having children enough to be a demographic threat to Israel in the long term. If Israel were to apply Israeli law to Judea and Samaria tomorrow, Jews, and forgetting Gaza, which we left in 2005, Jews would still make up nearly 2/3 majority in the land of Israel, and with our birth rates and their birth rates on the one hand, and our aliyah rates and prevention of the mass immigration of foreign jihadists into a Palestine, we would be fine, even if they were to get citizenship. It wouldn't be easy, but it certainly wouldn't be a demographic threat. And that brings me to, now that we've had our observation, now that we've seen what these natural processes are that are taking place both in Israel and in the Islamic world and in neighboring states, we ask ourselves, okay, so the two-state solution has again failed. Perhaps this time people will finally take seriously the fact that it never will succeed because the Palestinians don't want a state, they want to destroy Israel. And in fact, they don't want to exist without an Israel, which is why they don't want a state, because as long as they don't have the conflict, if they don't have the conflict, then they have Al-Qaeda. Right? If they're not fighting the Jews, then they're fighting themselves. We always said, well, we need the Arabs because otherwise we'd tear ourselves apart. Nothing like what they're doing to one another. Nothing. Nothing like what they're doing to one another. What can we do? Can we just stay where we are? Can we just say, all right, the status quo, we'll just keep things going as they are? Well, we can. But the problem with the status quo is that it's based upon this false view that Israel is in the wrong, right? The two-state model is predicated on this concept that all of these pathologies that we see unfolding in Syria and Iraq and Egypt and Libya and all these places is due to the absence of a Palestinian state. You know, John Kerry doesn't realize that he sounds like a nut job, right, when he says that it's all failed because Israel decided to build a couple hundred new homes in Gilo. He sees it in a completely different context that is based upon the two-state formula that says that the Jews are the reason why there's a problem in the Middle East, and the fewer Jews, or the smaller Israel is, the smaller the problem is, right? So if Jews are building in Gilo, that's a problem. Because we want a smaller Israel, not a bigger Israel. We want a less prosperous Israel. Jews are too rich. That's why they don't want peace. That's what he said twice. What a nice person, you know, because we're all, right, I mean, all he's doing is saying, I'm an anti-Semite, trust me. I'm an anti-Semite, trust me, you know. But, you know, he's making these ideas because he thinks that the reason why people are being crucified in Syria is because Jews are living in Dolev. Right? That's the prism through which people who embrace the two-state solution see the world. It makes it impossible for them to actually do the Shnat Shemitah and look and take a look for even a second at what's happening in the world around us. Right? Because if they do, then their whole view of everything falls to pieces and they can't blame the Jews anymore. But that's the whole point, is that the status quo is predicated on this formula of a two-state solution. And the two-state solution says that the reason why all of this is happening is because there's no Palestinian state. In 2010, I'll just give you one last quote and then I'll move on and we can do some questions and you can buy some books. But in 2010, Bill Clinton said that the establishment of a Palestinian state would bring about an immediate end to 50% of terrorism, not in the region, he said, but throughout the world. So from his perspective, and from his wife's perspective, and from the Obama administration's perspective, and by the way, from the Bush administration's perspective, the absence of a Palestinian state is the reason why Americans have to take their shoes off every time that they board an airplane. Right? What an idiot, but they all think that. Because the two-state solution propagates that worldview. It is predicated on that belief. It is predicated on the belief that the reason why the Middle East is such a violent, horrible place is because there's no Palestinian state. And the party responsible for the absence of that state, from the two-state solution's perspective, is Israel, because we're in control of that area. And if we say, well, we just need it for our security, we need defensible borders, they say, well, we don't care. We don't care if you can defend yourselves. We want to keep our shoes on at LaGuardia, for crying out loud, right? That's what they're saying. That's what they're saying. If it's your fault, Israel, that we're being inconvenienced, it's your fault, Israel, that America is hated. So is this too? So we say, well, we can just sit back and relax. If the Palestinians don't want to stay, we can just keep things going the way that they are. No, we can't, because every day that we maintain faith with this formula, with this narrative, we're undermining our own legitimacy as a nation state, when we should be able to articulate the truth, which is that we're the only thing that isn't falling apart in the Middle East. We are the only port in this horrible storm that the civilized world has in this critical region. And that the stronger that we are, the more secure geopolitical interests are. The better off the entire world is. Not just the United States, but Europe, South America, Asia. Everybody benefits from a strong Israel, and everybody is harmed by a weak one. And the two-state formula is predicated on making Israel into an indefensible, miserable, poor, and short-lived episode in human history. All right? That's what it's based upon. That's its goal, because that's the end state of the two-state solution. So, okay, so what do we do? So if the more prosperous and the stronger Israel is, the better off, obviously, the Jews are, but the better off everybody is. So we have to articulate a plan for making and maintaining and ensuring and guaranteeing Israel's continued strength and prosperity. And what is the only real way forward? What is the only viable option here? Sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, period. No more of this two-state nonsense. I knew I was coming to a supportive audience. I usually lead people to the water, and I say, now read the book and drink it. But I can actually give you the whole Megillah. So when we look at the demography, which is critical because we keep telling ourselves, oh, we're going to cease to be a Jewish state. We're going to become an apartheid state. No, we're not. It's not true. I mean, it's completely false. And the fact that we have to even have this argument shows us how debilitating this two-state narrative has actually been for us, right? That anybody could even think such a thing is so absurd. I mean, ask the Israeli Arabs, Assyrians, who are now begging to join the IDF, right? Ask the Israeli Christians. Ask the Israeli Muslims who are joining the IDF. The Atrash brothers from the Galilee were both soldiers in Golani because they want to protect their homeland, even if that means having to fight other Muslims. And those numbers are increasing, and, God willing, if the government of Israel is smart enough to help these people, it'll increase by leaps and bounds in the coming decade. We have got it all. We've got democracy. We've got a loving, nurturing society. I mean, just look what the people in Dolev are doing, bringing people from broken homes not only into an institution, but into their homes, because that's the way we are. And, Dolev is an extraordinary institution, and there are extraordinary institutions like that in Israel in a way that they don't exist anywhere else in the world, because it's just how we are. And it's not just to help Jews, it's also to help Muslims, it's also to help Christians, because that's just how we are. And that's why Israel is such an amazing place. We can do this. You know, I wrote in my book, I said, we have to offer the Palestinians grant the Palestinians of Judea and Samaria permanent residency status, as we gave to the residents of Jerusalem in 1967, and as we gave to the residents of Druze of the Golan Heights in 1981. And we have to give them the right to apply for Israeli citizenship. So a lot of people on the Israeli right started screaming, Caroline Glick wants to turn it into a binational state. She's gone completely mad. You know, she's become an anti-Zionist. I said they can apply for Israeli citizenship. And I meant it, by the way, and I still mean it. But again, you know, if you make very reasonable limitations on and restrictions on citizenship, like, for instance, no present or past affiliation with terrorist organizations, like, for instance, no present or past involvement in an anti-Semitic incitement, you know, you're ruling out about 2/3 of the Palestinians of Judea and Samaria. This is a fact. You add to that a basic requirement of loyalty to the State of Israel. I'm not calling for a binational state, but I am calling for saying, okay, look, you know what? You're not going to have a state west of the Jordan River. You want a state? You got Gaza? Welcome. Or you have Jordan. Go forth. Whatever you want. But Judea and Samaria is Israel. If Jordan is going to be Palestine or not, they get to decide. Judea and Samaria is Israel. We know it. We know it. We need it. It's ours by right, by law, and by necessity. We have to take possession of it, finally, and be done with this. And yes, it will present a massive challenge for Israel to do it, as I discuss in my book, but it is the only viable path for the future. It really is, and it is a viable path. Does it present Israel with challenges? Yes. Does it present it with existential threats? No. And that's the difference between Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria and Palestinian sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. One will enable us to move forward as a secure, strong, prosperous Jewish state, and the other will be our death warrant. So I'm optimistic. As you can understand, when we look back, when we take that step back, and we look at the situation, we look at the natural processes that have been unfolding in the land of Israel for the past 20 years, since the inauguration of the phony peace process on September 13th, 1993 on the White House lawn, when we look at what has happened in the intervening 21 years, on our side, on their side, in the Arab world writ large, we see time is on our side in many ways. But in order to cash in our chips and move forward, we have to also be willing to assert our rights to what are ours. Our ancestral lands, our historic homeland, they're ours. And we have to be willing to say that to an angry international community, to angry people on college campuses, to angry people in the White House and in the State Department. We have to be willing to stand straight up and say this belongs to the Jews, and the Jews are asserting our rights over our land. Thank you very much.
Right, I want to thank Carolyn for that briefing from the Caroline Glick Misrat Hasbara. Thank you very much.